Hello everyone. We are continuing our discussion on the garden, the significance of garden, and we have already delved into the history of the Mughals. And so first we see how Padshah Babur, when he arrived in the Indian subcontinent, he already was acquainted with the practice of making gardens in the barren lands or the lands which were unused. And so it was a part of his political conquest. At the same time, this idea of transforming this land into something much more habitable, much more pleasurable, and so on. So basically bringing the paradise into the earth. So this idea we find that to be that prompted his ambitions of designing Agra, the city which came to be the capital city of the Mughals for the very long time. So at this in the 16th century, when we find that Babur first arrived in Agra, then of course, as we know that the North Indian plains and in this particular area where the Doab region, which is between these two great rivers, that is Ganga and Yamuna, and here we find the land is mostly plain. There is no hills or there is no other kind of like ups and downs which Babur was used to. So when he looked into this place, and usually in a garden the source of water has always been very important, as I have already mentioned how the sources of water that holds high relevance in the Islamic philosophy. Now when Babur came to this particular area in the part of this North Indian plains, then he realized that kind of this ups and downs from which the mountain streams can be directed to the gardens for making these water channels is not something that is possible. And that is the reason we also find that he had also looked for the natural sources of water, and for that we also see how he had chosen the site of Agra, which is right beside the river Yamuna, to be this new site for building all his gardens. So one of the early gardens that we find, that is today known as Arambagh or Rambagh, and that is there in Agra. We have a shot from this garden in the left side of the screen, and here we find this clear implication of this Shaharbagh planning, where there are those symbolic channels of water which are flowing to the center part of this garden that is there, and in the center there is this one reservoir, and at the center there is also a fountain. So this is how the entire garden area was divided into these four parts, and as we have already discussed that we do not know that what all trees were there when this garden was established. Another thing we also find that since this is a cultivated area, either square or rectangular in shape, that is the reason it's usually we find those areas are walled. So there are high walls which will protect these places from, for example, here we see, so the high walls will be there to protect these places from the hustle and bustle of the city and whatever is there around it. And then there are also that gateways, for example the one we have here. So these gateways will be there for for the elites and the royals to come inside this garden of paradise. So this is one of the earliest surviving gardens that we find in Agra from this Mughal times, and slowly we find that there have been more and more development. Now this is an image that comes from Baburnama, which was painted in around 1590 and so on. So in the late 16th century, and then in this one we find how Babur is supervising making of this one of the gardens. So this is the garden of fidelity or Bagh-e-Wafa, and then this is the where we find that there are different kinds of trees, and people are still working here either for constructing the place or for taking care of it. So there are already flowering and like plants with which bear fruits that we have in this image. And then here is also how this Chaharbagh plan is now being laid out here. So people are working, and this high wall that I have already mentioned, that which is also there in the architectural remains in Agra that we see today, all of those things are there in this image. So in other words, the images, the paintings, that actually gives a sense of how these places were not just been there in the past, but how those places were also used. So there are birds singing. In some of the other images we also find representation of animals, so those also add to what we know about this gardens in the early modern times, and of course in the Mughal times. So this is an image that we find in art historian Eva Cox's writing, and she had made this, she had made a number of drawings on the location of the gardens in Agra, and she had also used one of this historic map which showed Agra and all the adjoining gardens. So around this area, what we find that this is the area of the city, and in this city, and this is the river Yamuna that we find, and around the and right beside the river Yamuna, in both its banks, there are many gardens. So all these are the location of the gardens, and altogether there have been around 41 gardens. So some of the gardens we do not really see them today, and some of them have been restored. Now in terms of this one, as we see that, I mean, this is the fort that we have here, the Agra fort that we know. So that is also situated by the river, and then all these other gardens that we have, and not necessarily all those gardens were built by the Mughal royals, but they were also built by the administrators, the ministers and so on, who were working for the Mughal royals. So we see that, I mean, all the elites of Agra in 16th century, 17th century and later times, they were building gardens around the in the both sides of the river. And this is the location, that is number 18. As we see, this is the location of Taj Mahal. We'll be addressing the history of Taj Mahal in later in this lecture. These are some of the it should give us an idea of this idea of the garden. It not just became prevalent for exercising this Islamic philosophy on earth, but it had much more socio-cultural aspects as well. And of course, that, as I have already mentioned, that Babur also wanted to transform the lands which he had conquered, so that also adds to the political aspect of it. Now in the socio-political aspect, the socio-cultural aspect, what we find that the gardens were not just been there for people to have these places as recreational places, but often there were also tombs, like the tombs of the revered ones, tombs of the noted nobles and so on. So they were also placed in these gardens. Now there are also some of the residential complexes which will find that they were situated right beside the garden, so, or at one of the corners of the garden. So if there are these residential complexes or the tomb complexes, either we find them to be at the center of the garden, or for many tombs that we find in Agra, in which we find that the tombs or the residential complexes will be further moved to the corner of the garden to have a view of the river. The river had been an integral part of the entire city planning and landscape. Now another thing we also need to remember, that in the 16th century, Agra was perhaps the most one of the most populous. At the same time, Agra was also one of the most prosperous cities in the entire South Asia, and perhaps one of the noted cities in the entire world. So of course today we do not really see the city of Agra the same way, but it had been the Mughal capital for a long time period. So that is the reason one can imagine that how all the nobles, all the royals, and of course the kings and so on, all of them were interested to build their gardens by the river. So in one hand we find there are those symbolic rivers which are made into this tangible garden by the means of those water channels, that is there. And on the other hand, we also have the river Yamuna, this actual river in the landscape, which had also played a very important role for supplying water in these gardens, and also for nurturing nurturing the livelihood of the people in the northern Indian plain. So that is how the significance of water, something that I have already mentioned at the beginning of this lecture, that how monsoon was also important in terms of for Hajj. And then here we find that this symbolic representation of the rivers of the paradise, at the same time the actual river Yamuna, they became very important part of the landscape here. Now, talking about Yamuna, we should also remember that this new way of understanding the relevance of the city, and also the new way of understanding the relevance of this river that was there in Agra, was drastically different from the town of Braj or Braj Bhumi, which was not that far from Agra. So in Braj we find the river was considered to be the holy river, and on the banks of Braj we find that how that already has been very important in the Hindu belief for its association with Lord Krishna. Now, if that is one way of treating or like paying respect to the river that we find in Braj, and from there when we come to Agra, we find there is much more, it's a different way of paying homage or respect to the river, and that is by understanding its perhaps its correlation to the rivers of paradise, but not explicitly saying that. And also that, I mean, how these two places, even though they are not that far from each other, but how these two places, they also they stand drastically different in terms of how the land is utilized and how the river is treated and how the places are organized or used by the devotees. So from the garden plannings in Agra, we find that, I mean, there was also a time when the capital was moved from Agra to the city of this city of Fatehpur Sikri, and that happened during the time of Mughal Emperor Akbar. So Mughal Emperor Akbar is one of the most important at the same time significant rulers during the Mughal time and during the Mughal era, and he is known for assimilating different kind of cultural, religious and artistic practices. So for that reason, what we find that he was not only just interested in this Timurid or this Persian plan of making the gardens, or how to bring this idea of this Persian garden to the Indian subcontinent, but he was equally invested in exploring some of the local materials and bringing the Persian plan close to something that was already there in this particular land, right? So for that reason, what we find that when he decided to move from Agra to Fatehpur Sikri, and this move did not happen very easily, but also this particular move from Agra to Fatehpur Sikri, it happened only for 10 years, and after that they relocated to the city of Agra. But when this happened, this was a chance for Emperor Akbar to exercise his new aspirations and all these ideas about how to bring different kind of belief system, philosophies, culture and artistic practices together. And in this one also we find this idea of the garden that played a very important role. So this city of Fatehpur Sikri, and if you remember that we have already spoken about this area, the Sikri is known for its sandstone, the red sandstone, and also we have this slightly yellowish and the grey sandstone, this sandstone that we find in this region. So the red characteristic Sikri sandstone is something that Akbar had picked up, and he had utilized this particular sandstone to the highest possible extent. So the red sandstone we also find that was used for different Buddhist images, for Hindu images, and now we see the same material was used in a very different context for making this city of Fatehpur Sikri, the city of victory. So here in the right side of the screen we have a planning of the fort complex of Fatehpur Sikri, the palace complex of Fatehpur Sikri, and in this one we find there are two major gardens which are there, and those will will be one garden was there by the Diwan-e-Aam, the place of public audience, where the ruler or the king would meet the public for knowing their grievances or listening to them. And then the other garden was there in the in the Zanana complex, or the complex of the women. And that particular garden was not just situated in the it was not situated on the ground level, but it was it was situated on the upper story of a building. So it's kind of that we see this idea of the garden had not only just allowed them to experiment it with the palace complexes, but they were also doing experiments in terms of where to place the garden and what all different kind of explorations can be done. And why I say this garden planning is also important for making the palace complex is because in these two very important areas we find the garden, and the gardens also sort of shape what all buildings will be there around it. So that is how we find the location of the garden is also something that is significant for making the architectural spaces in this entire palace complex. So, and if we get into the details of the architecture, that what all was happening and why I say this particular site of Fatehpur Sikri was such an important place, and that's because we see that some of the characteristic features that Akbar was successful to bring from the Persian context, for example Iwan, was brought together with some of the elements of the Rajput architecture. So, for example, to study Iwan, there is no better example than looking into Buland Darwaza, the main gateway towards the Fatehpur Sikri palace complex. So, this is Buland Darwaza in the left side of the screen, and here what we find that what is Iwan? Iwan is basically this large arched gateway like this one. This is an arch, and we see there is this large arched gateway. So, the large these gateways that has 4 sides, and for the 4 sides only one side will have a huge opening or like a considerably big opening, and the 3 other sides will be closed compared to what is there in one side. So, this particular form we find not only for making the gateways, but also in the religious structures, for example in the masjids and the tombs and so on. So, this Iwan structure we will be looking into it again and again when we study the Mughal structures. So, this Iwan structure we find that was brought from the Persian architectural lexicon, and then that was matched with some of the other architectural forms, for example the one we have here, and this is called the Chhatris. And Chhatri is something that is this this covered pavilions, and which were prevalent in the Rajput architecture, and the Chhatris are also been used as the memorial architectural forms in the Rajput context. So, we see this Chhatri structures are been brought from the Rajput context, and then that was merged with the Persian architectural form, and that is how this very syncretic architectural form was created. And if we also see the kind of material those are used here in terms of how this red sandstone plays a very important role in its aesthetics, and then there is also this yellow ochre, or like cream sandstone is there, and then there is also the sandstone which is gray, and all these things are then there that is matched by the white marble. So, marble has been used in the architecture during Akbar's time period very selectively, and this balance between red and white has been used to enhance the aesthetic appeal of this monumental architectural forms. If we get a little more into this cultural assimilation that happened during Akbar's time period, we also see how there are certain areas, and what were also been very interesting in terms of the assimilation that took place. So, one of the areas will certainly be within the palace complex of Fatehpur Sikri, and here we have one of the important sites in this palace complex, that is Anup Talao. And in Anup Talao also we find a similar kind of plan like the Chaharbagh garden planning or the 4-part garden planning has played out. So, this talao, which is also a man-made tank. This is square in its ground plan, and as the Chaharbagh plans will have that water channels, 4 water channels meeting at the center, and here instead of the water channels it's actually like filled with water, and then there are 4 pathways which take the people at the center of this structure. So it's almost the opposite of using water. So how water channels are flowed to the center, and here it is surrounded by water, but this pathways will lead people to the center, and at this center stage, which also sort of mimics this this central this reservoir kind of shape in the Chaharbagh gardens. This is the place which was used for performances and different kind of activities. So this is something we find how the garden, not only just this Chaharbagh planning, that not only just made its impact on how the gardens were constructed in Agra and Fatehpur Sikri, also how the other architectural plans were laid out around the garden, but people were doing that. The artisans, the Mughal artisans, the architects, the sculptors and masons, they were doing different kind of experiments to see what all different way this planning can be implemented. And apart from this garden and apart from this talao, we also see that there were some of the other structures, for example Panch Mahal and of course the Abdar Khana and so on. There these different kinds of architectural forms were been utilized. So in one hand, if we see that how this architectural form in the in the chhatri, and then if we see the Iwan and the arched gateways, which are also characteristic in the Mughal context, all of them are there. So in the other hand, we also find that how they were matched seamlessly. They were not being used as like collage of different materials put together abruptly, but they were matched seamlessly. And this the aesthetics of this red and white stones, like the red, which it's rich warm color, and white being something that is pristine, and at the same time white is also something that is related to spirituality. So this materiality, spirituality, and bringing like 2 different religions together, 2 different cultures together, that all had worked out very well in the town planning as well as in making the architecture of Fatehpur Sikri. And if we see that what all were the this different aspects, and how different kind of architectural motifs were brought into this conversation about the intercultural dialogue that took place in the Mughal architecture. So this is another example. So we know that Mughal architect during the Mughal time period, the most of the Indian subcontinent was brought under the Mughal rule. So something that we have seen during Ashoka's time period, and after Ashoka there was no other ruler or no other dynasty which could bring the large chunk or like most parts of the Indian subcontinent under their rule. So during Akbar's time period, we already know how from the eastern frontier of the Indian subcontinent, that is today's Bangladesh and northeast India, those parts, and then until the western frontiers of Pakistan and today's Afghanistan was all under the Mughal rule, and they were also expanding to the sites in the Deccan India. So we'll be getting into the Deccani history. So for that I'm not getting into the details right now. However, what we find that some of the structures which were prevalent in Bengal in the eastern frontier of the Mughal state, for example this terracotta temples. So here as we see these terracotta temples, and if you remember that our lecture on the Draupadi Ratha in Mamallapuram, I had already mentioned how this hut-like structure that is not always there in the temples or in the religious architecture in the Indian subcontinent, except for few pockets. So this is one of the examples that in Bengali architecture we find that how these terracotta temples would have this hut-like roof, and which is also called chala roof. Chala means this thatched roof which is placed on the top of these huts. So this particular structure in which we find this chala roof, and with the terracotta with the terracotta reliefs and plaques placed all over the exterior of the temples, This particular roof we also find with this, that was adopted in the Mughal architectural lexicon, and that also came into being this Bangla style roof. So that was called in the Mughal architecture, and some of the impact of this Bangla style roof we find in the city of Agra, in the northern Indian plains and different other parts of northern and eastern India. And this particular example here that we have in the right side of the screen, that actually comes from Lahore, in the Lahore fort area, which was also built by the Mughals, and this is called the Naulakha Pavilion. And Naulakha Pavilion, in this one we see that there is this marble structure, and in this marble, of course it was built in the 17th century, so it was later from Akbar's time period, but by this time we know this way in which the architectural the style, this Bangla style roof had already been established in the Mughal architecture. So in this Naulakha Pavilion we find that how this Bangla style roof was reinterpreted, but not with terracotta, not with brick or thatch roof, but with marble, as well as sometimes we also find with sandstone as well. So there are this kind of exchanges of material, exchanges in terms of this cultural forms, and that took place in this under the Mughal rule. And these are also some of the things that we see how the artisanal works in terms of utilizing stone, utilizing different kind of the local material were incorporated as part of the Mughal practices. So if we think about the use of red sandstone that was there in the northern Indian plains, so for example, as we have seen in Sikri, like the Sikri sandstone that was made as a very important part of the Mughal buildings, then the marbles usually came from Rajasthan, so the area what we know today as Rajasthan or Rajputana, and so Makrana and some of the other places were very well known for these marbles which were used and which were utilized in these buildings. Now, some of the other things that we also find here is that there are not really too many of the sculptures that we find in these buildings, and that also gives rise to the utilization of plastic or three-dimensional images and their use in Islam. But we see that there are vegetal motifs, creeper motifs, and different kind of low reliefs. Those were carved onto these stone surfaces. So here in the Naulakha Pavilion we see that there are at least two kinds of this embellishment. Those are used here. One will be the stone carving, and the other thing is called this inlay work or parchinkari. So we'll get into the details of both these kinds of work and their relationship to the city planning, the gardens, and everything else, and we'll continue this discussion. Thank you.